think that there's a difference between the way academics see the world and a lot of, I'd say, practitioners see the world, right? We're still taking things apart and trying to understand them. While practitioners, you're trying to put things together. There's quite a bit of experimentation in China. So they have been experimenting with data markets, right? Selling your own data. These are attempts to institute new kinds of markets. There's plenty of people coming out with new research every day about assetization. So there's plenty of stuff to read and continue reading. It's getting some, intellectual traction as well.
This is the Assetization Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tom Lyons, and this is the Assetization Podcast. And today, I'm really, really happy to have with us as our guest, Professor Kean Birch, who's a good friend of GenTwo's. He's the, or I like to call him, one of the world's leading experts in assetization. And we're going to talk about the assetization academic world. We're going to talk about how you guys connected with us here in GenTwo, and talk about assetization studies, I guess, and all of these things. First of all, Kean, maybe we can start with you telling us what brings you here to Zurich today.
Sure. So I love coming over to Europe. So always take the opportunity. I live and work in Canada, but most of my research actually resonates, I think, with Europeans more than it does North Americans. So I'm constantly trying to come over to Europe as much as possible. So I came over for multiple reasons, multiple events, including AssetRush here in Zurich. And prior to that, I was in Austria, in Graz, and in Vienna to give a couple of talks to academics. So this will be very different. It's going to be a very different kind of experience, I think, and it'll be very interesting to see the reception in the different audience.
So for people who don't know, AssetRush is GenTwo's yearly conference / rave or something. So it's actually can become one of the biggest and most important financial services events certainly in the Zurich calendar and the Swiss calendar. And it brings together innovators with investors and academics and product creators and a lot of various people for one day. And you get you get a 5-minute presentation, not more, and he really cuts the bell when you're done. Huh? And
here's a countdown, 5 minutes.
Countdown, and you get 5 minutes. So it's like one after the other. There's great networking. There's going to be an after party this year, sponsored by Forbes, with whom we also have a partnership. So it's going to be very interesting and probably something slightly different than you're used to in the academic setting, because this is really like boom, boom, boom.
I think
lights, music.
Yes. It's the first time I'm going to give a talk where I get music to, put in my entrance.
What did you choose? Everyone gets to choose their own entrance song.
It was a difficult decision. And so a bit of, personal information about myself. I actually like metal music. So I was thinking, should I do some, something like that? And I thought maybe a little bit lighter. So I went for Muse, and they have a song called Hysteria. And the first 30 seconds are great. So it kind of builds up and then kicks in. And I think at the 20-second mark, it really kicks in. And so hopefully I can enter at that point.
Okay.
Yes, we'll see.
I'll be watching and let you know. It's okay. Great. So Kean, I'd like to obviously get into the whole discussion of the academic view of assetization, which I don't think a lot of people know about. I didn't know about it. And that's why before we get into that, I'd like to recount how you and I met, because it's an interesting story. And it came about because of the book that we wrote called Assetization, which we wrote about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Actually, I started working on the project 2 years ago. And when we began, I started doing research, and I found out that there was already another book called Assetization.
Correct.
And first I was very upset, right? and I don't know what do we got into. And it was published by MIT Press and edited by you, and it's a collection of academic essays on the subject. Mm-hmm. And through that book, and through the fact that I think one of your colleagues reached out over social media,
tweeted out on social media,
we got together and discovered that far from being competition of any kind, we were sort of like, I remember, he wrote on the tweet, you've written the theoretical book and we've written the practical how-to
Correct. Yeah.
on assetization. Anyway, and since then, you've been here before. We've done several things together, and it's really great to have you also here in the studio on the podcast. So why don't we go back, do the history, and tell me a bit about, or tell our viewers a bit about this field of assetization studies, which is relatively new, how you got involved and how it all got started.
Sure. So I'm not sure if there is an assetization studies yet, but I guess we're trying to make it because there's a lot of people who are working in the area now, and it's really interesting the different kinds of topics that people cover. So the different things that people are studying. So hopefully, I say assetization studies, and I use that term, but I'm not sure if people have any other.
Fine with me.
Yes. So unfortunately, I don't have an origin story. And I say this a lot because I like to, I think about tracing my interest back to, where did it all start? But I think the closest I get to an origin story is that back in I think the late 2000s, early 2010s, there was a lot of interest in intellectual property, and in particular, the intellectual property rights and the both in terms of as an asset for startups in high tech sectors like the biotech sector, but also the implications of these intellectual properties for research, for knowledge production, and so on. So there's two sides of it. One is the kind of the dynamism of the startup industry, and the other one is the potential problems that it might cause to public research, academics, universities, and so on. So if I think about it now, I think of that time, that late 2000s, early 2010s, I think it starts emerging as a policy issue. And I think it starts emerging as a policy issue because the policymakers were starting to think about research and development as a particular kind of asset. And they started thinking about it that way, and started to try and change national accounting standards and things in order to incorporate R&D as an asset rather than as an expense.
As an expense, yeah.
Yeah. So they were trying to do that in these national accounting standards, and I think that fed through into a lot of debates that were going on that I started reading by the OECD, the World Bank, probably other international organizations like the IMF and so on. So there's a lot of interest in intellectual capital, knowledge capital, that all reflected, I think, this shifting way that policymakers and others were understanding what knowledge was or could be, and how to govern it, essentially, and the implications of that, negative and positive. Yeah. So I think that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Kean, I'd like to discuss with you what exactly you guys in the academic world mean when you talk about assetization, and contrast it a bit to what we mean. Obviously, for us, assetization is something very specific. It's the process of turning any kind of physical asset or an idea or something into a investable, bankable asset, really making it a financial security, basically. And there's different ways of doing it, and there's lots of different things you can do with that. You can bring a lot of things that weren't investable before into the investment universe. And I imagine that you think about assetization rather differently.
To some extent, but I think we're also, there's lots of overlaps, I think, as well. So for us, so going back to the work that I did with my colleague Fabian Meniza in the edited book that the book we edited together, Assetization, we start from a kind of accounting position when it comes to what an asset is. And so we start from the idea that an asset is something that can be controlled and or owned by an entity from which future benefits accrue to that entity, and those future benefits can be valued on the basis of discounting those future returns in the present. So that's a kind of framing for us, which is a very accounting-based notion of assets. And for us, our starting point was the academic debates, I think, and that's what we were trying to differentiate in those academic debates. What we saw as being different about capitalism today that wasn't coming through in the terms and the terminology that other people were using. And so a lot of debates in the fields that we were in talk a lot about commodities, commodification, And we were thinking this doesn't really capture some of the uniqueness of contemporary capitalism. And so assets and the asset form helps us to do that. And it helps us to do that by thinking about the transformation of things into this kind of capitalizable property that really changes the way that that we understand the economy, understand society, and understand the ways that the shifting governance frameworks that are changing the ways that we're managing societal resources and social relations and social interactions and everything really. So that was our starting point. Now there's some academic debates about this, ongoing academic debates, which are interesting around what do we mean by an asset and what are the characteristics of an asset and how that contrasts with a commodity and other or a product or a good, other kinds of sort of terms that we might use for economic objects that are probably a little bit esoteric, and so we probably don't need to go into them. But there are other, we're not totally focused on, say, financial assets in the way that maybe GenTwo is, and so we're interested in other kinds of dimensions of assets as well. So an asset that maybe is not simply based on, whose value is not based on discounting future returns. It might be some sort of historical cost accounting that determines its value. So there are maybe some differences there, but it's not. I don't think there are overlaps for sure. So it's not as it's not as sharp contrast, I don't think.
I have to be honest with you. When I first came across the book, which I then read, before I read it, I had some sort of sense that this would be quite critical of the process, but it didn't turn out to be at all.
It's quite critical in some ways. Yeah.
Tell me.
Yeah. I think
then the question becomes: is assetization a good thing?
Right. So I think the book, is definitely, there's people are critical of assetization, and I think it's because of you take the authors, the contributors to the book, they take a case, they look at it, they take it apart, and they try and understand what's going on in this transformation. Now, this is something that I've started to, I'm starting to try and think about the ways that different social actors, think about the world, which I find quite interesting because, being somebody who's interested in theory, and theory is a way of trying to come up with a general framework for understanding the world. This means that I am trying to try and look at how do different social actors see the world, and I think that there's a difference between the way academics see the world and a lot of, let's say, practitioners see the world, right? And I think that for the academic, at least in the disciplines I come from, the academic way of seeing the world is very, you can see it as critical, but I think I think a better framing is deconstructive, right? So what we do is we look at something, we want to understand it, and we take it apart. And in taking it apart, we have our own points of view and starting points. It's our analytical lens that we use, and that can be very different across different, from different disciplines and different kind of positions within those disciplines. But each, whatever we're doing, we are still taking things apart and trying to understand them and unpack them. And I think that's very, as I said, deconstructive, and it is, it can be critical and so on. While practitioners, you're trying to put things together.
Yeah,
right?
Actually, that's a good.
Right. Yeah,
that's a good way to compare and contrast.
So you're trying to create things,
right?
And that's a very different set of perspectives and skills, and you need a different set of techniques and all sorts of different things that makes a very different. You hold very different kind of viewpoints. So when I talk about social actors, I'm not sure if you're you've heard the phrase before, but do you get the sense of what a social actor is? Yeah, it's just anybody.
Anyone so interacting with whatever
in the world. Yeah, so in social world. Yeah, so different social actors come at the social world with different perspectives, and it's useful to understand those different perspectives. So I'm always, when I'm thinking about the work I do, that's you're trying to understand that point of view, that lens that the social actors you're studying have, because that's the only way to then look at the world, understand the world and unpack it in a way that is not simply a kind of imposition of an analytical starting point. So it is interactive. It's not just simply that you take the social actors lens viewpoint and you report on it. You also, there's an iterative process with the existing literature, analytical theories that you draw on, and way of understand, and that shapes the way you understand the world theoretically. And I think that's an important thing to kind of get at when you're trying to understand the academic world, which can often seem very esoteric and we're focused on very small, narrow things, and navel gazing and so on. But actually, it's part of the kind of academic process as well.
But there was a concrete side to it as well. I thought maybe could you, for people who haven't seen it yet, just quickly outline the original book that you guys did? Like I'm interested in, what are some of the subjects that people tackled and some of the cases they looked at? Because that might be interesting for the people watching. And then after that, we can talk about new things.
Sure. So the book came out in 2020. So it is actually, I forget how long ago the start of COVID was, but that's the year of COVID, right? So I actually had to unbox the book during COVID, which was, I got a big box and I opened it and I was like, wow, we got loads of books. But it came out in 2020, but it originated in a conference in Barcelona in 2016. So it was even 4 years before that.
Okay.
And we put out this call, Fabian and I put out this call for papers, and we actually had a really surprising response. So we had, I think it was about over 30 proposals for presenting at this conference. We whittled it down to 25 that could fit. So we had 5 panels, a full day of maybe even over a day of people coming and talking about these topics. And then afterwards, like most academic publications, we invite people to submit and submit an abstract for a book proposal, and then we submit it, and then we hear 2 years later that yes, you've got the book and things. It's a slow process. It wasn't quite that slow, but so the topics that the people that submitted papers fell within, I think it was four broad topic areas, I think. So we had knowledge, we had nature, we had infrastructure, and I think we had sort of social society.
Mm-hmm. And some examples of what that means?
Yeah, sure. So within the knowledge section, we had some papers talking about intellectual property rights like patents, especially in the I think it was in the biotech sector especially,
mm-hmm. Right.
And the ways that for example, intellectual property rights are turned into an asset that becomes valuable and that can be used, specifically to a financial asset that can be used to attract funding. And this has been an interest of mine, and I'd been working on this as well, back to that time in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that I mentioned earlier. So there's a long history of this in the biotech sector of companies, startups developing, some form of technique or new kind of diagnosis or potential drug targets or something like that. That because they're startups, they don't have the capacity to pursue, and so one way to fund their other activities is to essentially sell their IP.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what they're
ahead of time.
Yeah. So they might not, in any sense, they might not want to develop whatever it is that they're going to sell. They might just focus on one project because they don't have the capacity to do the other things that they got. So they would fund through selling off their IP. And that was a major financing route for them, for startups, that provided them with capital, but did have some implications that were problematic. One of the implications that became very problematic, and it was a kind of unintended consequence of their strategies, was that you got these companies who are called patent trolls. I don't know if you've heard. Yeah, you've heard.
Sure. Yes.
So they're more officially called non-performing entities because they don't do anything, right?
I love that.
Yeah.
I've worked for a couple of non-performing entities, but that's a different story.
But their strategy was you buy the IP, and then you sue, and that's a way
Yeah.
of generating your income from the intellectual property, and that's their business model. So that obviously, if you think about innovative startups and so on, that's problematic for them if they want to develop new kinds of biopharmaceuticals or diagnoses or whatever. So that was one example. That's probably a bit more in depth than maybe I'll do with the rest of them. But the other examples include work on. So when it comes to the kind of nature and environment, there's work on natural capital accounting. So what are the implications of natural capital accounting, which is treating the environment or ecosystems as assets, and what that means, and how that leads to particular kinds of investment strategies that might have unintended consequences. There's also work on oil wells, which is really fascinating work that I think is probably not as developed as it should be. So especially in a country like Canada, where I'm from, where you have an enormous number of these oil wells that once they stop producing oil, what do you do with them, right? And so you have this a set of again, maybe there are intended consequences this time that you're trying to pass off. Some of these companies try and pass off the end of these oil wells that hit their end of life and get rid of them without having to pay for the cost of remediation. Then there's some work on infrastructure. So I think paper on railways in Spain. There's another one on.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, there's another one on wind farms and solar panels, and the different ways that you assetize, the sun when you assetize the wind, right? And what are the implications there, and how you have to organize it. And then there was work on this kind of social side of things on student loan and student loan debt. And also social impact bonds and ways of trying to change social welfare policies through creating kind of investable objects. The student loan ones is interesting because that raises the question of discount rates. And so discount rates, the government set the discount rate to determine the value, and they change the discount rate, which changes the value. So it has this kind of really interesting dynamic, and there's certain expectations that governments have around student loans. This is in the UK, so maybe it's different in different countries, but certain expectations that a large proportion won't ever be paid back, and that kind of factors into their valuation and so on. So that's that book, Assetization, from MIT Press.
Since the book came out, you and I have had some conversations, and I know that one of the things you also become more and more interested in is the subject of data and data assetization. When you were here last year, we had the Terrace Talk outside, and that was a big subject then. So do you want to maybe bring us a bit up to speed onto that aspect of it, and maybe some of the new areas that you assetization academics are looking at?
Right, sure. Yeah, so data's become a big one, and I think it's become, and again, this actually, there's a nice confluence with with that kind of origin story, where that, I think, as I said, came out as a consequence of changes to the national accounting standards. And actually that's what's happened. That's what's been happening over the last few years, is that they've been revised again. And they've just, the UN Statistical Division, I think, has just produced its new system of national accounts, which updated these national accounting standards to integrate digital data as an asset in national accounting. So there's a really interesting kind of similarity in the periods of time, I think. So now is another time when there could be another burst in interest in assets and assetization as a consequence of this kind of these policy activities. And I'm doing a project on it, and it's kind of partly because I was already interested in this and I was already looking at what was going on with the UN and the update of the system of national accounts, and partly because it's just a really big topic right now. So we can see it's a big topic because of the rise of the big tech companies, the concerns about the data they've collected and they're using. There's that kind of issue, but it's also a big topic in terms of how do we encourage the use of data in our economies in a way that is that we want it to be used. So responsibly, and that has these kind of creates these social benefits and so on, without simply being a money grab, whatever, right? So there's this kind of set of potentially contradictory pressures that arise with data. That on the one hand, we really need to know who's collecting data, how valuable it is to them, because the transparency ensures that we can try and hold people to account. And on the other hand, we want to be able to enable the aggregation of data to make better decisions, policy decisions, or better build better infrastructure, or build better products and services, right? All these sorts of things that require this data, and so we want to break open at least in my view, we want to break open these kinds of what I call data enclaves to enable better access to data, and ensure that it's used responsibly, within the frameworks of privacy, data protection regulations, and so on. So that's, to me, is a really big set of issues that I think has many different dimensions to it, and it's also highly geographically specific. So there's what I've just mentioned about national accounting standards is, it's a global attempt to do that, but different countries are taking different kinds of approaches to this. So we could see, somewhere like the US, which is a much more liberal economy. It has a much more fragmented set of regulatory data regulations, where it's at the state level, versus the EU, which has a much more sort of supranational integrated attempt to regulate. GDPR, but they've got the Data Markets Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, but they've got a Data Act now, a Data Governance Act. So they have this suite of they are ways, these regulations and acts are ways, are part of, or frameworks for designing new kinds of markets, really, the markets that the EU wants them to be, not just simply like the kind of almost laissez-faire US kind of arrangements. And then you've got China, and China is very different. There's a lot more localization regulations about data and where it can sit, but there's a lot more. There's quite a bit of experimentation in China. So they have been experimenting with data markets, right? Selling your own data on these kind of data markets. They're not. They haven't achieved what I think the Chinese government was expecting them to do, but there's these are attempts to institute new kinds of markets, which with the right kind of privacy, data protection regulations around them, it's interesting to see.
Is it working? I'm asking because I was in the blockchain industry for about 7 years before I came here, and there was a lot of talk, of course, about monetization of personal data and data sovereignty, and also on the identity side, the whole self-sovereignty side, and when you first come across that, it's a very exciting prospect, but I haven't really seen it happening effectively. Is that happening in China?
I don't think it's happening effectively.
Okay, either.
I think they have created these markets, but I don't think it's not taken off. And I think that there are reasons for that, and I think part of the reasons is to do with the idea that individuals and individuals' data is valuable, has some sort of value, whether that's intrinsic or whether it's relational or whatever. I think that yes, it does have value, but the value is very small.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if an individual is going into a data market and saying, "Hey, do you want to buy my data?" Their data is going to be worth pittance, basically.
Yeah, I remember seeing, and I shouldn't be quoted on this, but I remember something like someone did a study, and I mean the aggregate value of Facebook data is in the billions, but for an individual it's like $40 a year, or something like this.
Yeah.
So then, is it even worth going through all the trouble?
Yeah, and it's interesting that also plays out in the courts, because we see part of the research that I'm doing now, and it's being led by some others in part of the project I'm doing now, but being led by others in Australia. Someone called Jake Goldenfine, who's at Melbourne University, is working with a student there, Emma Finlay, they're collecting a data set of court cases dealing with data value. And the court cases they've collected are fascinating because you get an insight in how the law treats this value. And it's the same sort of thing where, the law sees the value of data because it's an individual's, series of individual data points is relatively minuscule. And the problem being that the law also tells the individual bringing the suit, there's nothing limiting you selling your data, so someone's taking it, but you can still sell it. There's no, it's that kind of non-rivalrous nature of data, right? Nothing, someone else using your data doesn't stop you using it and you selling it. So there's no harm, there's no economic harm there, which is interesting to see. And I think what we might see...
Well, unless they take my data and sell it to the person I wanted to sell it to.
Well, yeah, you'd have to make that case.
Yeah.
So you have to make you'd have to show that there was harm to, like, you were already going to sell it, and then someone like nipped in front of you and sold it to them, and that led
sounds like a big deal for over a small amount of money.
Yes, so it'd be $40, right? Yeah, the harm is $40.
Go to court for that, you probably won't.
Yeah. So that's really that's for me, that's really interesting. All those kinds of issues, and it's led to me thinking, trying to think through how do we treat data in a more collective manner that maybe has meaning, has more of a kind of relevance for how we govern it collectively, in order to ensure that those returns are not simply appropriated by big tech companies that can collect all that data and no one else can then benefit from it.
So obviously we're all for wrapping assets and making them investable. Do you think there is an ethical and a sort of positive, in a societal sense, use for data markets and for these IP markets and for selling, making these types of assets investable?
Well, there's always a case. I think it's how you arrange it, the frameworks that you use to develop it. So I think that's what's, like, I started my research by looking at assetization as a process. How are things turned into assets? And that is fascinating in itself, but it's led to my concern now with assetization as a form of governance. How do we govern things that we turned into assets? And there's we probably don't want to turn everything into an asset. I know that might be a difference that we have, but
no, we also say in our book that that wouldn't be right.
Yeah.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
It's quite the contrary.
Yeah. So we don't. There are certain things that if we do turn into an asset, and maybe that we can govern them in ways that we collectively might want to govern them. So data for me, data is a good example of that. So if we as individuals cannot govern it ourselves as individuals, then collectively we can govern it, put our data together, have all this, instead of having individual data points, we have, a full, database of all this information that is very useful to a lot of different institutions, governments, businesses, and so on. And just like an oil wealth fund, you charge for access, and you have use those returns, the revenues you generate from that to protect, to support the wealth fund, but also, there might be needs for, technological solutions for governance issues that you can then support, and you can fund all those sorts of things through this wealth, and you can, fund other kinds of social policies, social delivery, all those sorts of things through this, just like you have with the wealth fund. So that would be one way of thinking of, how you can, totally organize, govern resources, societal resources, in different ways when you think of them as an asset. And you can certainly do it in, with other, you can do it with other kinds of things. There are examples that I think are interesting from a personal perspective, where we could think about, how do we turn, or how do we disrupt, let's say, a an existing market that seems to be increasingly dysfunctional. And for academics, we often look at the publishing, academic publishing market and think that's incredibly dysfunctional. Because,
Yes, it is.
Yeah, because we're giving our labor away for free when we write something, away for free when we edit something, away for free when we review for something, most of the time. And all of those things, that free labor gets appropriated and by publishers who have huge margins and so on. So, is there a way of trying to rethink that market in order to disrupt that market and potentially create new kinds of arrangements that change the governance of knowledge production and change the governance of knowledge dissemination? Yeah, so that'd be another kind of example, but that's a very specific one to academia.
And again, this was also things that we talked a lot about I haven't talked a lot about in the blockchain world with tokenization of your own IP, or you can tokenize, or your research, for example. I remember use cases where pharmaceutical researchers, for example, could you could tokenize your little bit of the molecule or whatever, or Bitcoin. As it goes through the world, you can get the royalties, and same with publishing. And I know there have been blockchain projects. It's basically focused on academic publishing, and I guess at some point maybe your citations are worth something as they go through the world. We're doing something I always thought is slightly similar in this idea of wrapping things into assets, as was happening with tokenization, just without a blockchain, just using the standard financial products, the standard financial wrappers like AMC or a tracker or these certificates. What interests you now that we've been working together for more than a year and know each other a bit in a company like GenTwo? What do you think you can learn from it?
So what fascinates me, going back to my academic mind, is how are things done, right? So learning about how do you transform something into an asset, right? That I find fascinating, because there's so many component parts there and so many elements to it that I just don't know, and I'm still trying to learn, because to give you an example, so I'm trying to do a project on alternative asset classes at the minute, and I'm talking to a range of people in the financial markets, and I came across the idea of a custodian, and to you that might seem very, I don't know, let's just think, yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's a standard
normal.
protocol.
Yeah, right.
You have to have one.
Right.
Because the asset has to be something.
Yeah, exactly.
Be
But
safe.
for me, it's like, well, why have I not heard of that?
Okay.
Right? And so it comes up, and this comes up from reading material. So I'm reading a lot about tokenization at the minute, and so it comes up in that literature, and the idea that maybe you can get rid of the custodian or whatever because you have a distributed ledger technology or blockchain, which doesn't look like it's the case, but then thinking about the custodian is really interesting when you think about alternative assets and future alternative assets, and what the custodian's role is, and how they what do they do in the creation of an asset, immobilize it, for example, so that it's no longer you can't you've immobilized that asset, no one can access it, and no one can trade it out from underneath the financial assets or the tokens that are being traded on top of it. So that's incredibly important. Or putting a piece of artwork in a safe or a vault or something, and like fractionalizing the value of that art and things like that, which I think is part of the plot of Tenet, the film. I don't know if you've seen that film. No. Okay, right. So there's a piece of art in a free port somewhere that they try and get to. But so that is really interesting, because then to think conceptually about what the custodians need to do for different types of things to be turned into an asset becomes really interesting. What are they doing? There's physical assets that you need some sort of physical, immobilization somewhere, or some sort of physical registration that here are the assets that that we are tokenizing, and you can maybe there's a constant video stream of the asset that you can look at and that is there, or it's a digital asset, and how do you immobilize a digital asset? So, or how do you act as a custodian for a digital asset and so on. So that's the sort of thing that pops up in the research that keeps me going and makes it really interesting to think about these things. And then that comes in. If you think about a custodian, I guess you can start thinking about the ethics and the governance of it, and those kinds of implications as well.
Kean, that's great. It's been a great talk so far. Just maybe you want to tell us a little bit about what's next, what you're up to after you leave Europe, and where your research is going.
Sure. Yeah. So continuing with my research on data, that's going to be that's got another couple of years to run. So I'm going to continue doing that. I have this project on alternative asset classes, which I'm really interested in pursuing and will be pursuing for the next few years, I think, because my sense is that with all sorts of financial, technological changes, that this and just the sheer rise in the private capital markets, that this is going to be something that will run and run. And so I'm interested in trying to stay on top of that in the next few years. And I'm already finding it fascinating, so I'll get into that more. And I'm also going to, I've got other projects on the go, and I'll be looking at more kind of, I suppose, more academic kind of topics that are of concern to us academics, but maybe less so to regular, normal people. Yes.
Well, yes and no. I had the pleasure of joining one of your Assetization reading groups, and that actually became a podcast with Pierre-Luc, which is I'll put the link in the show notes, which we did on the Assetization of baseball players, and it was kind of fascinating for me to see this community of assetization academics, and according to it's been growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's great to see the interest. This reading group ran the whole academic year, I guess, and we had a good six sessions on it, and look forward to doing it again next year. So we have I think we have over 100 people who have signed up to the reading listserv, and there's plenty of people coming out with new research every day about assetization. So there's plenty of stuff to read and continue reading, and there's some it's getting some intellectual traction as well. So there's some really exciting new material that's come out, new publications that have just come out that I'm looking forward to digging into more fully. Yeah.
Kean, as always, it's been a great pleasure talking. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Bye-bye.